I love it when it starts and finishes on time. Good morning. Hello, Chantel.
Hi, good morning.
Haven't seen you in a long time.
I know. Thank you so much for having me back again. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for educating us. Because
I'll
that's
do
my
my
goal.
best.
I want our people to be educated so we give the best service to our customers and keep them coming back for more.
Absolutely. Surprises are not usually a good thing in our line of work. So
No, especially when they're preventable. And
100%.
new changes going on.
There is. So I'm going to talk a little bit on some of those changes coming up. And maybe it's some information you already know, but it's awareness is important too. So
You just took my words. Awareness gives you flexibility, and flexibility gives you options, and options give you power. So I did take a class on the new foreign stuff. So I know a little bit about that, but I'm sure you know more. Well, let's just talk a little bit. I want to give you some kudos. So you're with White Plains Tax Solutions.
Close. White
Sands.
Sands. Yes, like the beach.
Sands. That's right. White Sands Tax Solutions. You're based in Venice.
Mhm.
Your kind of niche is real estate agents doing tax returns, with another niche of Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act, which is really huge in your part of the world because Venice, Sarasota attracts a lot of foreign buyers, right?
Exactly.
And foreign FIRPTA, Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act, is really, really critical when you're selling, but the disclosure of the seller's requirements to a buyer when they're buying is critical too. So it's nice to have that conversation and know enough to know, and this is important for me, to know enough to know who to refer to. Because I really don't want our agents taking on the role of advising them on tax implications and things like that. That's your role. And you've told me the couple of times we've been together that you do free consultations. And
I do.
And we've called you a couple of times and you've helped us out a lot. So very, very helpful. So where would you like to, well, let's start with two things. So first of all, personal agents tax returns. I always get referrals saying, hey, who do I get my taxes done? Because as a real estate agent now, if you guys are a real estate agent, you should not be doing your own income taxes, period, end of story. Even if I get TurboTax or whatever else you have, no, it doesn't replace the professional. It's funny. I'll tell you a long story short. So I just put a new kitchen in my downstairs patio. And I know damn well how to connect a gas line. So the people that installed the appliances says, we don't do the gas work. So I went to Home Depot and I went to actually Ace Hardware and I bought some gas lines. And I got down and hooked them all up and talked to the guy at Ace and thought I knew everything I did. And long story short, I bought the wrong hoses. So I had to take those back and I go to the guy and he says, by the way, what kind of regulator are you using? A regulator? Do I need a regulator? He goes, hell yeah, you need a regulator. The gas is coming out of that tank at 2,500 PSI. You'll blow up your whole house. And I went, oh shit. Okay, I'm calling a gas man. Gas man comes out and did a beautiful job. The fittings were all tight, neatly put away and secured and just worth it. It was $200 and much better than me doing it by myself. So then I did, and this is me, a real estate broker, right? I had a new water heater installed and the plumber says, I don't do electrical work. And I said, well, I can connect the electrical. There's a red wire and a green wire and a ground. I can do that. So I did it. And then, but I didn't terminate the old wires and I didn't clean up the junction box and I didn't put it in conduit. So I got this super expensive water heater in this nice home and it's got loose wires hanging all over the place and not a good thing to do. So it's like a real estate agent doing their own taxes. No, when Chantel does them, they'll be nicely bound in a bow and it comes in a little book and it's all ready. And heaven forbid you ever get audited or something, everything's organized and you got somebody on your side. So number one is agents taxes. 2, Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act. 3 is those new foreign, what are they called? Dangerous countries. Is that what it's called? Dangerous? There's another word for it, I think.
There's another word, but it's escaping me right now.
It's like countries of threat or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Threatening countries. So anyway, I'm sure you've got a presentation for us, which I know you do.
I do. And just to kind of recap, I mean, when we assist realtors with their tax return, like we don't represent the IRS, we represent the realtor. Our job is to help the realtor as much as possible. And we have frequently saved our clients $20,000 to $30,000 in tax every year
Oh,
for
yeah.
the few, for the little bit that you pay us compared to the potential tax savings. When we just make some minor restructuring, we don't usually like to reinvent the wheel or change everything that you do or do anything really aggressive. It's just, making you aware of those things that you're already doing, structuring things slightly differently, and we can save a ton of money for you on an annual basis. It's definitely worth it to reach out to myself or someone with similar experience.
I couldn't agree more.
So we're here to help.
That's right. And there's all kinds of little things. There's a book that I've read for many years. Robert Kiyosaki is an author that I follow. He was the guy who wrote Rich Dad Poor Dad, and he has spawned a career of making money in real estate, using real estate investments. And we've had a big push in our company about using real estate investments now to start deferring income and creating passive income. So anyway, part of Robert Kiyosaki's world is a guy named Tom Wheelwright, who's become a co-author with Robert on a bunch of these books. And he has a really cool thing that he says, you'll never get rich paying taxes. And because it takes so much of our money, as you start making more money, you're in the 40% tax bracket. That's a lot of income. And to pay that much in taxes, scary. So he's using real estate, which I'm sure you advise some clients to start investing in some passive income too. My favorite story is he told his wife he wanted a Ferrari. And rather than get pissed off, she says, well, what are you going to buy to make the payment? So he went and bought an apartment complex that paid the $2,500 a month in cash flow to make the Ferrari payment. Just a different way to do things. And we get involved with a tax, what's the word I want to use? Proficient accountant. They can help you do things that you wouldn't think about doing yourself. I'm fortunate our CFO is like that for me. He coaches me on all kinds of things. That's why I buy new cars once in a while and try to depreciate things and all this other stuff we do. So fun stuff. But we do.
Yes. Do you want me to get started here?
Yep. I made you co-host. You're in charge.
All right. Sorry, it always takes me a half a second to figure out.
The green button in the middle says share screen.
Yes, there we go. All right. Can you see the main screen there?
We do.
Okay, perfect. So let's get started. As you know, we like to have this really interactive, which is why I really appreciate presenting with you, because it makes it more of a fun conversation. FERPTA may be a little bit of dry material. I think it's really exciting and interesting, but I get that sentiment is not shared by all. But anyway, thank you for joining me.
Well, let me ask you, so you're a CPA, that's a certified public accountant. What is a CAA?
Yes. So CAA is a certified acceptance agent. What that means is I can certify passports for ITIN applications. So that's a really important designation that I also hold, and it is not easy to get. So I'm really glad to be able to do that, because it certainly makes working with the clients a lot easier.
Very cool.
So, and I'm licensed in Montana and Florida, of all places. So, but as an accountant, as a licensed CPA, we can do returns for clients anywhere. So we're not restricted to those areas in any way.
Wow.
But so FERPTA is a really important topic. Again, just that awareness is really important for you guys. Not necessarily to know all the details, the ins and outs, but mostly who to call, what to be watching for, when to get a professional involved is key. And I always say it's starting as soon as possible. So you set your clients up for success, whether you're representing the buyer or the seller, just making them aware of the little unique quirks of FERPTA. And how this is going to work for them will definitely set them up for success. And again, surprises are rarely good in this industry.
Can I tell a quick story? You tell me if I'm right.
Sure.
Okay, so I think what the message is overall behind FERPTA is, when we as Americans make a profit, we pay we pay income tax on our income. But if a foreigner comes into our country and they invest and they make a profit, and they take that home to their country, their home country, they cheat our government out of tax. So FERPTA is designed to say, hey, you guys are welcome to come here and invest in our real estate, but before you take your profits back home where we can't touch them, we want you to pay tax here. Is that pretty much a good example?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically to protect local Americans buying real estate. We shouldn't be disadvantaged over people from other countries. So it's a way that the government's come up with to sort of level the playing field. And a lot of countries have similar provisions. They all work a little bit differently. As a Canadian and US citizen, I'm somewhat familiar with the Canada restrictions, and in my opinion, they're a whole lot worse than what we have here. They're very involved and very intricate. But yeah, it's a common provision that a lot of countries have, and again, it's to protect the citizens of that country. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be confusing. It can be a little bit overwhelming. So our goal is just to simplify that a little bit.
Perfect.
So, all right, let me see if this is gonna, there we go. Okay, so I wanted to start with some updates. I know some of you have likely joined us before, so not to bore you, but to start with some of those things that have changed since we spoke last. The first thing I wanted to highlight is just ongoing challenges with the IRS. I spoke to 2 agents in a row representing the FERPTA department, and both of them used the term decimated. The FERPTA department within the IRS has been decimated since COVID. So I think, whether they've repurposed those agents, they haven't been able to replace it. FERPTA is a really unique area within the IRS. But the number of agents working in that department is not what it needs to be in order for that department to run smoothly. So as a result, we're seeing some really interesting notices coming out. It's challenging to get certain things to process timely. So things like withholding certificate. So we're still not even touching. Typically, the IRS would process a withholding certificate in 60 to 90 days, and now it's taking upwards of a year. So just the timing difference between where we were and where we are now is insane. The other thing that I wanted to bring to your attention, which I think is really not fantastic for what we do and for what you do, is that we've actually had 2 buyers receive notices from the IRS stating that the IRS did not receive their withholding, the FERPTA withholding check. And those are sales that have happened in 2023. And we have proof that the IRS has processed those checks. They've received them, they've processed, they're in the IRS system, but the buyer is still getting notices. They're scary notices. They have large interest and penalties associated. And usually when we talk about, 15% of the sale price of the property, we're not talking about small numbers. These are large, painful amounts. And so it's fairly easy to get those responses into the IRS. We have proof of the process check. But just again, to bring that awareness, in all of my years of dealing with FERPTA, I've never had a buyer just receive a notice for the IRS not receiving those funds, and to have 2 so far this year for 2023 sales is kind of incredible. So the takeaway is make sure that there's somebody handling, an accountant handling the FERPTA side of things, and that your buyer also has our contact information to be able to reach out and say, hey, I got this notice, please take care of it for me.
You just made me think of something. It could take up to a year. So really a foreign seller needs to start planning this activity in advance. Because, we're still selling houses, sometimes multiple offers in a day or 2. And some houses we're selling, it takes 4 or 5 months, but most everything's selling. But if you're talking a year to get a certificate, that's problematic.
It's huge. So we've stopped doing them. We don't recommend them. They just take far too long. If you had the perfect scenario where you had a buyer and seller willing to wait for that withholding certificate, and the withholding certificate basically reduces the FERPTA upfront from 15% to whatever the gain is on the sale. So it can be a really useful tool. but you have to have the perfect parameter, because once we send in that application, the sale more or less has to follow. So if there's a change in pricing, a year down the road, the buyer may not be interested in that property at the same price, or the seller may no longer be interested in selling it. So now we've wasted a year. So we've just basically taken that tool off the table for our clients. And I would be a little bit hesitant to use that until that FERPTA department is working a little bit better. So far, it doesn't look like it's quite trending in that direction yet. So I haven't even tried in 23 and 22. We tried 2 of them. One was beginning of, I think it was January 27th, the sale closed. And by the following February, March, we'd given up and sent in the full withholding and filed the tax returns. So it's not a great situation.
Wow.
So it's important to, I don't want to scare anyone with that. It's just who do you call if you have that situation come up? We have all the tools to say, yes, this check was processed. It's an easy letter to the IRS, but it's the timing of it, making sure that somebody is addressing it properly. The other thing that, just to bring a bit of an awareness, is that the FERPTA forms themselves, so this is the forms that accompany that check to the IRS. They've been updated the beginning of this year. So just make sure they look a little bit more involved. There's a few more boxes. Overall, your standard FERPTA is going to follow the same series of information, the same series of boxes being completed, but they have updated those forms. They look a little bit different. And then the last huge update for 2023 is the Senate Bill 264. And this is something that you want to take some time understanding. As an accountant, we're aware of it, but we're really not the authority. You really should be speaking with an attorney on this. If you have a questionable situation or you're not quite sure how to handle it, I would definitely recommend reaching out to an attorney over your accountant.
Well, let me add to that because it's important. I attended a webinar from FAR, the Florida Association of Realtors. And as a realtor, we have to uphold 2 standards. One is non-discrimination and 2 is fair housing. So in that situation, China, the People's Republic of China, is one of those countries that is not allowed to buy in Florida within 10 miles of a naval base or a strategic installation. So, but you can't assume that just because they look Oriental, that they're from China. So you could be discriminating by just telling them about this act. So what FAR has told us is you point that out to everybody. It's written in our new contracts that became live July 1st, and everybody, because you don't know, they could look American and be from another dangerous country. So it's really important and they're saying there's spies, that FAR has got, spies out there, but lack of a better word, informants, if you will, testing to see if we're disclosing this properly. And they really put the onus. So non-discrimination and fair housing are 2 really important things. So their advice was 100%, please read this paragraph and talk to your attorney if you have any questions on it. So it's not even a soft, brush it aside. Tell every single person, I need you to read this paragraph. And if you have any questions about it, please call an attorney. So I just want to stress that point again, because I've got 500 agents out there and it's really easy to, I'm not going to tell this guy, because obviously he's a blue collar guy from Chicago. You don't know that. So if you do it with everybody, it'll work better. So my 2 cents.
No, 100%. Appearances can be deceiving. So never make an assumption anywhere. And this is a really important change, and especially when something is so new and we don't know exactly how it's going to be applied. How aggressive are the penalties? What does this look like? It takes a little bit of time for all of that to kind of wash out. Obviously, there's always, people pushing back on it. So what are those changes as a result of some of those potential lawsuits being brought forward? Is this discriminatory? How do we make it not? It's going to be a moving subject for some time. I will say, I did read an article earlier this week from McDermott, Will and Emery, which are Florida-based. They're more on the accounting tax law side, so they can bring a little bit from both sides of the table. But I've attended some of their seminars before. I think they do a pretty good job. So that might be a resource to look out for. There are other attorneys who are putting forth articles on this topic. So make sure that if you are asking questions or you're sending clients to ask questions, you're sending them to a knowledgeable source, to somebody who can speak on it and speak on it well.
And notice your PowerPoint says Florida restrictions on buyers. There's only 5 states in the country that have adopted these types of restrictions. So this is not a nationwide epidemic. This is in the state of Florida. If you are from one of those countries, I think there's 7 of them, then you cannot buy certain properties.
So yeah, so the countries are China, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, Korea, Cuba, and Syria is what I have written down for that list of countries.
Yep.
So again, that's a July 1st start date. So we're in it. Agricultural land, you have to be really cognizant of. There's some restrictions on there. And then what I thought was also interesting is we have folks who've already purchased those. They already own that. What do they do? And so they are required to register their ownership. So that's something, if you know of somebody who already owns something and they're not aware of this, that they need to go ahead and register their ownership. There is an affidavit, I believe, for newly purchased items to make sure that they verify, or they're verifying that they're meet the requirements and they can purchase those properties. If there is a violation, what they're saying is the land could be forfeited. So it's really important to make sure you don't sell something that then the buyer isn't able to actually keep. And then the most important thing is for yourselves as realtors is it's considered a misdemeanor if you knowingly violate this new law. So of course you're kind of the first line of defense when it comes to these types of things. You're the one speaking to that potential buyer first. And so they've put some of that onus on you to identify those folks. So yeah, I don't know, Craig, do you have anything else to add on that topic?
I just remember some of the fines. The forfeiture of the property of the state was one, and $1,000 a day is another fine. That's $365,000 a year. You know, so this is something we need to take serious. It's not a lot. We don't do a lot of foreign sales, but when we do, we have to advise them to get advice. And that's really the key, is that we have to advise them to get advice. We don't give advice. We advise them to get it. So if you know some law firms that specialize in that would be helpful for us, because your average run-the-muck lawyer is not going to know about this.
Exactly. So that one that I mentioned, I know they've done some research into it, but you still need to ask some questions too. You know, not every attorney is created equally or has equally done their homework on this topic. So just make sure if you are reaching out for advice, it's somebody who has heavily researched that information and they can properly and appropriately give you that advice.
Agreed.
It's kind of a scary world with some of these changes and the things that we're responsible for.
Well, you're dealing with terrorism. And if, you know, somebody like Tampa Electric Company is a big power plant here. It's 2 miles from my house. So they've got a huge coal reserve. They've got a huge natural gas reserve. So somebody could literally send a bomb within a 10-mile radius and hit that natural gas line. That would create a major problem for power for the entire area. It's to protect against terrorism. And those countries have been known to be aggressive toward Americans. So I see why they're doing it, but dangling the discrimination in the Fair Housing Act to a bunch of realtors that's described to a code of ethics, that's a whole different story.
Exactly. It's a fine line that we have to walk.
Okay, now this is interesting because there's a lot of miscommunication here too. Yeah, there's a list of the countries, Nancy. Chantel, would you read them again? It was Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. China, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, Korea, Cuba, and Syria.
So a Cuban buyer can't buy within 10 miles of a military installation or a strategic reserve or some special strategic something. So TICO is a strategic something. There's data centers that are restricted that you can't buy within 10 miles of. We don't even know what they are. And the law is very unclear. And there's no real list of what is a strategic installation. So we need to know and then find out. Lauren, is this the first time there's been this types of restrictions? Now, there's 5 states that have done it now. Florida was the 5th one, but the other 45 have not. So Jackie Pope says, I had 2 Canadian sellers who sold their properties here and the buyer signed a statement of intent to reside. How does that, we just talked about that. That was the, what did you call it again? It's taken a year to get signed now.
Oh, the withholding certificate, but I think she's talking potentially about the personal use affidavit.
Okay. Is that still working?
Personal use affidavits are great. That works.
Okay. Yeah. So if the buyer says, hey, I'm going to reside in this house, then it relieves the seller from the obligation to withhold the withholding tax, which is 15% of the purchase price.
See
Right.
what, so there's certain restrictions in there, but more or less they get a lower withholding rate if the buyer signs that.
So that's a friendly thing for a buyer to do. So if you want your buyer's offer to be accepted and you know it's a foreign seller, say, hey, we're willing to sign the residential reside affidavit to reside, which is nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Now,
it's
go ahead.
sorry. Oh, I was gonna say it's a great tool. I have had some attorneys on occasion recommend that their buyers not sign that form. I'm not sure from a tax standpoint why that would be recommended. You know, it is written into what we have to follow for guidance for FERPTA as an allowable option. So, but I have worked with a number of attorneys who have just flat out said that they don't recommend it, that they won't recommend it. So that's something to be cognizant of, even if your buyer initially is willing to sign it. They may get advice to contrary to that.
Because I mean, the theory is that you agree that you're going to reside there for 2 years, but the code does say if you have a legitimate reason you have to move, you know, they waive it.
Right, so it's the intention. So as long as the intention is there, if the intention isn't there, then I don't recommend it. But if the intention is there and something comes up that changes the circumstance, a health issue, a change in job location, you know, those types of things, the IRS does carve that out and say that they won't hold you to that as long as your legitimate intention is for personal use.
Yeah. And Dennis asks, is it North or South Korea? I believe it's both. They're both unstable. So
that's a good question. I'm not 100% sure.
it doesn't say. I've read it. It says Korea. So assume both.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. So we'll have to, that's something we'll have to monitor closely and just see how that shakes out. And, you know, too, if you think about just the way that Florida is mapped out and the restrictions on farmland or agricultural land versus a 10-mile radius from any important installment. We're talking airports and water treatment plants and military bases and a whole host of things because, you know, geographically where the houses are, we're really restricting a lot of those buyers to very specific areas. I haven't mapped it. I kind of wanted to this morning, but I ran out of time just to see, and I don't even know if a current map exists of what that looks like. But you know, if you're representing that type of client as the buyer, you may be really limited in what you can show them.
Very much so. Michelle, what paragraph in the contract? It's not a paragraph. It's right above the signature line on the last page of the contract. And it's outlined in a bold black lined box. And it says, attention buyers and sellers, please read this. It's really clear. It's right above the signature line of the contract. So our advice again is to point it out and say, please, I want you to read this paragraph carefully. If you have any questions, I need you to talk to your attorney because this is a new law that just came into effect in July.
So
I'm just reading as they come in, Lana said, if a past foreign buyer still owned the property but became a green card holder, do they still need to register? Once again, we don't want to give advice on this. The answer is talk to an attorney because it depends. There's green card holders, there's work visas, there's different types of way residency you can have. But if they don't register, they can be subject to penalties and including forfeiture of land. That's one, Dick Wilson. This is not logical to me. No. Well, the other 45 states agree with you. Nancy says North Korea on Florida Realtors. What I read on FAR was it just said Korea itself. But still, once again, we're not here to judge or jury. We're here to say, if you have any questions about this, call an attorney that is familiar with it. Okay, good. All right. That's a lot of questions coming up. Good. I'm glad. I would think that our agents are smart. They want to do good things.
Yeah, no, and that's fantastic. And again, it's just to bring that awareness and to be watching out for certain things. And yeah, we'll see how this goes.
Yep.
Okay, so I know we kind of talked about a lot of terms and what they are and restrictions and challenges with them, but let me go back and actually talk about what those actually are. So I apologize for those of you who are less familiar with FIRPTA because we kind of jumped ahead on a few things, but we'll go back and clear some of those up for you. So FIRPTA is Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. Again, it's just that leveling of the playing field for Americans versus non-Americans. The way the FIRPTA laws are written is really interesting. Basically, everyone has a level of responsibility. So as the realtor, you're responsible. Obviously, my job requires a level of responsibility. Your closing agent has a level of responsibility. And then your buyer and seller. So everyone kind of is somewhat involved when it comes to FIRPTA, and we all have different roles to play. So it's important to know what that role is. Your role as the realtor is really, again, bringing that awareness to your client, making sure that you, again, help to identify who may be subject to this. I believe there's some forms, Craig, that you have as part of your packet too, where they have to disclose, am I a foreign person or am I a US domestic person? And so be paying attention to that, but sometimes you have those conversations before you get to the signing of forms. So the sooner you can kind of bring that awareness to your client, especially when you have a potential foreign seller, the better off you are. Again, turning a blind eye is not going to work well for you. You do have a level of responsibility. Kind of the worst thing that can happen if you turn a blind eye and you knowingly and willingly don't address this as a situation that needs to be navigated, is you can essentially forfeit your commissions. So nobody likes to work for free. So it is something to kind of pay attention to, make sure that you're getting that seller hooked up with the right folks who can help them out further.
Okay, so this is gonna be a basic question, and I'm really confused on it too, so don't feel silly, anybody else watching, but I've got a Canadian customer. They have a US residency card. Are they subject to FIRPTA?
So like a green card?
Mhm.
They would not be. But that's a trick question because there are certain countries where having a green card does not automatically require a filing for US taxes. So if you have a Czech client from the Czech Republic and they are selling a property and they have a green card, they have a different scenario than your Canadian who also has a green card. So things on the surface are not, I was really surprised by that. That kind of blew me away. But a person from the Czech Republic, the green card, the way the green card is addressed between the treaties of those two countries is different than for somebody from Canada.
Wow. So it really does pay to talk to you or somebody like you who knows the rules. And then there's work visas, and then there's some people have citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
I
So
don't know how
there's
all that works.
there's so many varying levels of, is FERPTA required, is it not? So it really pays to have somebody else come into that conversation and ask those leading questions to determine safely, is this something that requires a withholding, or are we okay and this person is actually considered a US person and not subject to the FERPTA withholding? There's been a couple of cases too where I've had clients who are in the US, they're residing in the US, but they're not legally able to reside here. They're not filing US tax returns. Usually in those cases, the laws are a little bit unclear. Usually I recommend the safer approach. Let's withhold FERPTA so that everyone is kind of secure in what we're doing. And then the client can request the excess funds back at the end of the day.
And then you also have foreigners who own corporations or LLCs that are based in Florida. And the rules on that are shaky too, right?
Exactly. So an LLC, a single member LLC, so one person owning that LLC, there's a look-through provision. Just because that's a Florida LLC does not mean that person is not subject to FERPTA. So they still are, and there's actually additional forms that they have to file as a foreign person owning a US LLC. If they fail to file those forms, there's an automatic $25,000 per year penalty. So that's something that, the IRS doesn't mess around with some of those. So depending on the type of entity that is, if it's a partnership, it gets different treatment. If it's a corporation, that gets a different treatment. Again, it really pays to have somebody who's going to ask those additional questions. Just because you see a Florida LLC as a seller of your property doesn't mean anything at the end of the day.
Wow.
So yeah, so keep your eyes open. Again, just, be cautious, reach out. Like Craig said at the beginning, we do offer complimentary consultations because little questions like this come up all the time. And so I'd rather you guys reach out to us and we can take a look and ask a few more questions and give you some of that assurance before you complete that sale and then you have an issue down the road.
Yeah, I just don't want an agent saying, oh, it's a Florida LLC, it's fine. No, it's not necessarily. It's a foreign seller that's not a US citizen. It could be subject to, and you didn't call it. Now, where the disclosures and the contract, the purchase and sale contract references FERPTA, and the seller affirms that they are not a foreign person. And if they are, then there's a FERPTA addendum to use. So it's all built into the contract. So attend our
if it does get a little shaky, and we have seen situations where the seller is quite adamant that they are not foreign, but we can't make that full determination on whether they are or not. We recommend that they sign a foreign affidavit, basically stating under penalties of perjury that they are a US domestic person and not subject to FERPTA. So, if it gets to that level, that's kind of the final option, is to still have them sign something of that nature stating you can use a W-9 form, but sometimes that still doesn't provide that extra level of security. This is kind of the top level is a non-foreign affidavit. I will say too, that something that's come up more recently than normal, just in our practice, is if you do see someone and they have a social security number, that does not mean that they're not foreign. So, if they sold a property 20 years ago, I actually had a Canadian couple that I met with a couple of weeks ago. They happened to sell a property in like the 90s. And they were eligible for a social security number. They have a full social security number and they are 100% foreign. So just because they have a social doesn't make them domestic either.
Wow.
So yeah, I don't know. There's something new every day. But yeah, just have those questions, ask a lot of questions, bring them to us and we can help you out there. Also their days in the US play in. So some of our counterparts or other people working in the FERPTA arena will just look at the substantial presence test, which just looks at their number of days in the US. Technically, this is what the guidance puts forward is, do they meet the substantial presence test or not? We always like to go a couple layers beneath that and just keep digging and making sure that, because just because they met the substantial presence test, their ties still can be closer to a foreign country. They still may be able to use a treaty not to file a US or to have limited income reported on a US tax return. So we always kind of go a few more levels beneath just what is their days of presence in the US. If you have somebody moving into the country, they may not be subject to FERPTA if their intention is to live here for the full year or more than half of the year in that current situation. But again, we get into kind of that gray area of what's their intention and are we safe or not?
Mhm.
So I'm going to speed up a little bit just because I see the time is going. Craig, is that fine? Or do you want me to?
We'll go back to that one slide. I'll ask a question on that one.
Yeah.
Do they file a US resident tax return
Mhm.
and they have to provide their worldwide income? That sounds pretty onerous.
Yeah, so that's usually when they say, oh yeah, we file a US tax return, I say that's nice. But is it the form 1040? Is it what you or I file? Or is it a non-resident tax return? If it's a non-resident tax return, you're only reporting your US sourced income. So we also have a lot of clients who work with accountants who are just not as familiar with foreign implications and how best to treat that. So perhaps their accountant wasn't aware they filed a 1040 or used the 1040 form, but still didn't include their worldwide income. So I always, again, just keep digging beneath the surface. As a US person, you're required to report your worldwide activity. If you are receiving income from other countries, that needs to be reported on your US tax return too.
Okay.
So that kind of shows that true intent of you are fully a US person if you're kind of following within all the guidance of a standard US person.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah. Any other questions with this area?
No, we're moving pretty quick.
Okay. So personal use affidavits, again, we kind of touched on this. Personal use affidavits, in my opinion, are fantastic. In my practice, I've never had this be questioned. Again, I've had attorneys who have recommended that their clients not sign it, or if it's not a clear situation, not the best option for your buyer. This is a form that's signed by the buyer on the transaction. If the selling price is less than 300,000 and that buyer is willing to sign this form, and this form basically states their intention over the next two 12-month periods. So it's two separate tests. They have to meet it for each test or for each time period test, that their intention is to use this property for their personal use, more so than as an investment property. Then they're eligible to sign this form. So in the most extreme situation, if that property is essentially left vacant for the year, they spend 2 nights in it, or they spend 1 night in the property and their son spends 1 night in their property, or a grandparent or a sister or brother, that all qualifies as their family use. As part of that personal use, it doesn't, you can buy a property for your son to live at and still be able to sign this form. So sorry, going back to my example, if somebody uses it 2 nights personally, and then they rent it for 1 night out of that 12-month period, they still meet the qualifications. It's still primarily for personal use. So it can still be like a seasonal rental. They just have to use that property more personally than as a rental. And
That's
then, yeah.
important for our condo hotels.
So there can be restrictions on rental periods and so forth. So that's something that, may be just off the table from the beginning. If there's restrictions on rentals, or short-term rentals or whatever that might be, sometimes the property restricts whether this is a possibility or not. But it can be a really great tool for your sellers to reduce that upfront withholding. In my opinion, it doesn't add more liability to the buyer. The buyer is responsible for making sure that FERPTA is handled appropriately. This is one of those tools that shows that FERPTA is being handled appropriately. So in my opinion, there's really no greater risk for your buyer to sign this form. And it can be really helpful for your seller and definitely a bargaining chip.
Definitely.
Um,
And if the purchaser is an entity, it's an automatic 15%.
Yes, this has to be an individual buyer. Thank you, Greg. It cannot be purchased in the name of a trust and in an LLC and a partnership. It has to be an individual signing the personal use affidavit, taking title in their personal name. So if it's going to be purchased by an entity of any sort, you're automatically not eligible to use this affidavit.
Just popped in my head, but you said you were born Canadian,
Yes,
but you're also a US citizen. So are you subject to FERPTA? No,
no,
Because
I'm
you're-
not.
you're a US citizen and you file a US tax return.
Correct.
A question just came into the chat. What if you're military and you were born in a foreign country, but on a military base? Because I think in that case, they get double passports.
Yeah, and that would depend. The US is one of those two special countries that taxes you as a US person, regardless of your residency. So if you obtain US citizenship at birth, then you likely would not be subject to FERPTA, regardless of where in the world that happened to be, whether it's a military base or just happens to be a foreign country to US parents or something of that nature. Your Canadian parents were on vacation or the closest hospital was in the US. Those folks are all considered US citizens. They're granted citizenship at birth.
Wow.
And so they are considered US persons, which for FERPTA works great. For everything else, not so great, because they're filing US tax returns, even though they may have only spent 2 days in the US when they were first born.
Wow. Now, how did you become a US citizen? Did you have to spend a certain amount of time here or?
Yeah, so I had a spousal green card, and then I had to spend, I believe it was 6 years within the US before applying for citizenship. So I'm a naturalized citizen.
Got it.
So not an overly fun process if somebody is attempting to go through it. The citizenship part was the easiest for me. Getting the green card is not so easy, even as a Canadian.
Wow.
So yeah, everyone has different paths. So it's really interesting to see some of those here in Florida.
Yep. A lot of them are Uber drivers.
Yes. Oh God, am I frozen on the screen or am I okay?
Your voice is okay, but your picture's frozen.
Okay, sorry about that.
Sometimes just turn your camera off and turn it back on and it'll probably fix it.
Okay, let me see if I can do that without losing you.
Stop video, bottom left.
There we go. Is that gonna work? Can you still hear me?
We hear you fine.
Oh, I'm frozen. Okay, hang on.
Yeah, now turn it back on and you should be, there you go. You're back.
Are we good? Okay. Sorry, I have it on the screen behind me. I have multiple screens up, so I have to find the right one. As an accountant, multiple screens are important. Anyway, okay, so just wanted to go through the process of how FERPTA works for you. Because the more that you can explain or kind of help your clients through the process, the more appreciative they're going to be and better set up for success. So usually it's the closing agent who handles withholding those FERPTA funds from the buyer on behalf of the seller. So they'll be the ones, creating the check that's going to go to the IRS. We're the ones who create the forms that accompany that check to go to the IRS. The FERPTA packet has to be submitted within 20 days of that transfer. So it is in your best interest that we have all of that information together kind of at closing or before closing. And then there's 2 forms that are going to accompany that check to the IRS that shows the IRS how to apply those funds. This becomes really important, especially if your client does not have a US identification number, an ITIN or a social, because basically the IRS has nobody to match those funds up to. So it kind of sits with a few identifying factors, those being usually the property address and the buyer's information. So it gets really interesting when we have a foreign buyer and a foreign seller. Then the only tool that the IRS has to match up these funds with those 2 parties is the address of the property. So it's really important that we include as much information on these forms as we can, so that down the road we can help the IRS to match that up if they don't do it correctly the first time. The form 8288, that's actually your buyer signing that form. The seller doesn't sign any of the FIRPTA forms, which is really interesting. Your buyer is who's acting as the withholding agent. So they're taking responsibility, saying that, you know, this was addressed correctly. We have all the pieces. A lot of buyers get obviously a little bit nervous about the fact that it's their signature, it's their information going on these forms. I usually give them the example of like an employer-employee situation. So I guess the employer, you're responsible for withholding federal income tax from your employees' checks and making sure that that gets sent to the IRS. But at the end of the day, it's your employees' responsibility to file their own tax return, to have told you the right amount. You know, if there's extra tax owing on their tax return, it's your employee's responsibility. So similarly, it's your seller's responsibility. The buyer, once they sign everything and that gets transferred into the IRS, that's kind of the end of what they're ultimately responsible for. And then the responsibility transfers over to your seller. So usually if I frame it that way, they understand a little bit more. It's still a little bit scary. But you know, this is something that happens frequently. As long as everything's taken care of, your buyer can sleep soundly at night. And then there's additional forms that accompany, and it basically, the form 8288A is individually for each of your seller. So if you have a husband and wife, and husband is foreign and wife is a US person, only 50% of that property will be subject to FIRPTA. And so only that foreign piece, that foreign person, has FIRPTA withholding on their portion, and that's sent into the IRS. The US person doesn't have a requirement here.
And then when that money gets sent to the IRS, then they process the tax return. And if it's all been paid, they get their money back.
Exactly. Yeah. So just depending, once we do that calculation, really the seller has about 40,000 worth of gain available to them at a 0% tax rate. So as long as their gain isn't greater than about $40,000 per individual or per seller, usually they'll get the bulk of that refund back. I've only had one situation where the client actually owed once filing the tax, or at tax time, when they filed their tax return. It was a small amount, but you know, usually FIRPTA is designed to be more than what the tax will be. And so it's very rare that they don't get at least a portion of those withholding funds back once the tax return's filed.
But the idea was, if we gave them their money now and they flew back to their home country, we'd never get it back from them.
Exactly. There's no incentive. Who's going to file a tax return when you've already left? And a lot of these are, you know, in Florida, older folks, they're leaving because they're not able to return. They're not filing a US tax return. So with our current situation and the increase in housing valuations, as you're well aware of, a lot of our clients are seeing less of that refund just because the gain is so large.
Yep.
And then once all of that goes in, the IRS starts processing those forms. The seller will receive a series of forms. The IRS communicates via postal mail, especially in these cases. There's no email or phone calls from the IRS. They're going to send postal mail, and they'll kind of update the client on the process as it gets processed through each stage.
What's the typical wait time to get your refund back?
That's a great question. If the tax return is submitted electronically, the client already has their identifying numbers. They have the stamped copy of the 8288A, which is confirmation that the FERPTA has fully been processed. We've had some clients receive their refund within that almost normal 4 to 6 weeks. That's pushing it a little bit. That's rare. I still say about on average is maybe that 6 to 8 months to get that refund back. And that's from the time that the tax return is filed, not from the time that the FERPTA is submitted. In some occasions, just given the current state of the IRS, I have had a couple of refunds that have been held up for in excess of 2 years, which is not great. Where it's just a constant back and forth. We keep responding, and for whatever reason, the IRS just cannot put that information together for them.
Wow.
So it's a long wait. You have to be, even though that money is coming back to you and it will come back eventually, sometimes it does take considerable time to receive it.
Complicated stuff.
Yeah, hire somebody who's been through it before and can help guide you along the way.
Yeah. Another slide. There we go.
Okay. Yes. So withholding certificates, again, this is the piece that we don't recommend. This is kind of like a pre-audit to reduce that upfront withholding. Because again, the default FERPTA price is, or default FERPTA is 15% of the sale price of the property. So this used to be a really great tool that we could use to reduce that upfront withholding. But with the IRS taking over a year to process these, the tax return has become faster. And so we have not been recommending them. But you will have clients who are somewhat aware of this as a tool. It's just in the current situation, not something that we recommend. We talked a little bit about these numbers, so you will come across folks who have no US identifying numbers. They are eligible to apply for an ITIN, an individual taxpayer identification number. They do have to show verification of identity. Again, this is where we can come in and we can certify their passports for them. In order to certify the passport, I do have to have it in my hand. So if they're not here for closing, they do have to mail that passport to us so that we can physically see it, physically take a copy in our office. But we can do a video chat similar to what we're doing now and have the ITIN application interview that way. And that is an allowable solution to those folks not physically coming here. We have found that us certifying the passport has had the highest success rate. Just because the client goes to an IRS office and applies directly through the IRS, the agent accepting that application is not always well versed in ITINs. And so sometimes they'll accept the information and the required proof isn't attached or a box isn't checked. They're not looking for that. They're just taking it in. You can also get a certified copy of the passport. Again, we've had some where the IRS has rejected this, and it's kind of interesting. Even Passport Canada, which I'm very familiar with because I've dealt with them personally, they meet all the requirements to certify the passport by the government. I've had a couple of ITIN applications with a certified copy from Passport Canada reject. So usually with a certified acceptance agent, we have the highest success rate. The timing of this is really interesting. You'll sometimes get some pushback from the closing agent because they want the ITIN applied for prior to closing. That is a little bit complicated because we need to include the signed closing documents or the signed FERPTA forms as part of the application process. Otherwise, the IRS won't process the ITIN application. So we do usually recommend that we apply right after closing for this number. And then usually this part of the IRS is actually working fairly well right now. So we can typically get those ITIN numbers within about 8 to 12 weeks. So that's working well. Oh, expired ITINs, that's another thing I want to bring up. If your client has an ID number already, they can continue to use it. If they have not used it on a tax return in 3 years, or if the middle digits are a certain series, it's deemed to have expired. They have to renew that ITIN number prior to filing the tax return, prior for the IRS to release that refund for them. So they may have to go through a similar process. Basically, the application is identical except for one box saying I already have one versus another box saying this is a new ITIN.
Wow.
So any question there?
I think the overall answer is call you.
Yes, that's what we're here for. Our goal is to make this easy.
Do you
And
have a contact information slide?
Yes, so let me we'll skip over this renting of the property, but just be aware that if you're a foreign owner renting property, there are some restrictions or certain things that we can do to make that situation a little bit better. We talked a little bit about the filing requirements already.
Mhm.
And we also kind of touched on those other forms of ownership. So a US LLC or US trust has that look through provision. So just be aware of that. If the owners are foreign, then that property is still subject to FIRPTA. US partnerships are the exception. So if you have a new buyer coming into the market, and they can potentially file or form a partnership prior to purchase, then that might be a good way of getting around some of those FIRPTA restrictions. But then you have that annual filing requirement attached to that ownership. So, and then here we are. So thank you for bearing with me. This is my contact information, and email is usually the best way to reach me. I'm on my email constantly. I'll do my best to get you a timely answer. Information that's important is letting me know where in the process you are. If closing is tomorrow, or you're at the closing table and the question comes up, make sure that you communicate that to me so that I understand the sense of urgency. You know, we can put things together really quickly if we need to. We have created a FIRPTA packet while everyone's sitting at the table to get that over. That's not the preferred method. If we can do it in advance and have some of these conversations prior, that certainly works better. But sometimes it does happen. So we're here to help out.
Very nice. Very helpful. And I think we decided you're gonna come back in November and we're gonna do a real estate agent tax planning event.
Yeah, I'm excited for that one. So there's so many different tools that we can use and put forward. And really our goal is to keep more money in your pocket. So there's a lot of cool ways that we can do that with minimal effort, which I like.
And we'll see you closer to the end of the year. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Talk to you soon.
All
Actually,
right.
I have a question for you. I'll email you later.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.